Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Mark Rose, President of DCL. Mark is a recognized authority on XML implementation and document conversion. Mark serves as project executive with overall responsibility for resource management and planning. Prior to joining DCL in 1981, Mark was with the consulting practice of Arthur Young and Company. Mark has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Columbia University and an MBA from New York University. He has also taught at the New York University Graduate School of Business, the New School, and Pace University. Mark is a frequent speaker on the topic of automated conversions to XML and SGML. We also like to introduce Stephani Clark, Customer Success Manager for easyDITA, a data component content management system based in Rochester, New York. She works to train and assist users of easyDITA software. Stephani also works on easyDITA's information development team and spends about half her time creating technical documentation for the software. Before she worked for easyDITA, Stephani spent over 10 years working for her family's energy efficiency company. During that time, she worked in sales management, operations, and project management. Stephani also developed the company's training program and served as their national training administrator, which brought her to Rochester in 2010 when the company opened an office there. When Stephani isn't working, she's usually spending time with her family. Stephani lives in Rochester with her husband, Ryan, her one-year-old son, Jack, and her dog, Carlos. Her favorite activity is spending time with her son, but she also enjoys cooking, reading, traveling, and organizing anything and everything. Without further ado, welcome Mark and Stephani.
Thank you, Adam.
Okay, this is Mark. I just want to say I'm really excited about co-presenting this webinar with easyDITA and really delighted to have Stephani Clark with us on this webinar, and it's really been a real pleasure working her and developing this webinar for you. Today's webinar is going to focus on making content accessible to people with disabilities, which is becoming a larger issue lately. Some might say it's about time. It's really taken quite a bit of time to develop the kind of infrastructure that's needed to make this happen, but we're very excited about that also and about the developments that have been happening. Today's webinar, we're going to do a little bit of background on what is document accessibility, why it's important today, and the methodology that's being used. But today's webinar is going to focus on converting documents to XML, and in particular DITA, which allows you to make accessible documents almost automatically once it's in that point. Previous webinars we've done have talked about PDF and remediating PDF so it's accessible, and that's a different topic by itself. But I think going to XML and has a lot of other advantages, which is important to be able to speak about. We're going to, Stephani's going to be talking about the whole approaches and how DITA makes them accessible, and we're going to end with two things. One is a series of resources on accessibility, in particular 508, and then as Adam mentioned, we should have time for Q&A at the end. Next slide. All right, so first, just a quick, I don't know what those question marks are on the left side, but what is Data Conversion Laboratory? Very quickly, Data Conversion Laboratory, DCL, is a woman-owned small business now celebrating its 36th year. We're headquartered in New York. We have 70 full-time employees based in New York, as well as some people in various other parts of the country. DCL converts documents, and that's been our core business for many years. The converting documents has many meanings and many more today than it did 36 years ago, but primarily we think people think of us as scanning and digitizing documents, but also converting to various things. The third bullet, sub-bullet below, is talking about enhancement of document. In particular, what we've seen a lot of activity lately is enhancing documents to make them accessible in various ways to allow people with disabilities to interact with documents, websites, and other information technology. There's also a lot of enrichment automation. Artificial intelligence has come into this whole industry, and we're very active in using artificial intelligence to automate the process and to make documents richer and smarter. I'm going to turn that over, and the next slide, I'm going to turn over to Stephanie to tell you a little bit about easyDITA. Stephanie?
Thanks, Mark. So hi, I'm Stephani Clark, and I want to thank Mark and DCL for the pleasure of putting this webinar together with me today. Real briefly, I'll tell you a bit about easyDITA. We are a software company, and easyDITA is a tool produced by Jorsic, and it is a DITA component content management system. What that means is that it's a tool where you can create content in DITA XML, which we'll get into a little bit later in more detail. Component management system, component content management system means that our software has a lot of capabilities to enable you to manage, reuse, translate, tag content with metadata, all sorts of things that you can do to better manage your content, and then ultimately publish it to a number of outputs. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment, but I'll hand it back to Mark to cover some more background now.
Okay, so just a little bit of background. I date modern accessibility back to when Ray Kurzweil invented the reading machine in 1974. Of course, there were things before that. Braille coexisted before that, and there's other, older technologies. But I think that automated technology and digitization really starts right around then. And that quote over there from Stevie Wonder, which he made at the 2016 Grammys, "We need to make every single thing accessible to every person with a disability," is quite right. And if you can, Adam, if you can start up that little video over here, which talks about Stevie Wonder's first meeting up with Ray Kurzweil in the reading machine.
It actually started in '75 when there was this thing on the news about this man who had come up with a way that would enable a blind person to be able to read. And I said, this is crazy, this is impossible, I gotta meet this person. Obviously, it was a life changer. I mean, for me, it was really, really kind of big, but however big it was, it didn't matter because, listen, for the first time, a blind person would be able to read his or her private information. It was an amazing experience.
The current cost of $10,000 to $20,000 makes the machine practical only for libraries, institutions, or rehabilitation centers.
Okay, that's a picture of very young Ray Kurzweil, and what we talk about is the first reading machine. This is also, incidentally, the beginning of all OCR, optic recognition technology. It was originally designed to read a book to blind people. And all the things we do now with OCRing documents by the millions really started with this 1974 piece of equipment. So I thought that was a very interesting insight. Next slide, Adam. So what do we mean by document accessibility? Just 2 points I want to make, and these are from some of the documents, the base documents and the legalities of it. Document operations considered accessible, meets certain technical criteria, and can be used by person with disabilities. I just want to make the point that we usually think of blind or low vision. It means more than that. It means people who are mobility impaired, that they can't handle a keyboard necessarily, or other things. Blind or low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, which is two different categories, which, one is more serious than the other, I suppose, or they have other kinds of cognitive impairments, like they're dyslexic or can't hit, things like that. And the point of it is to make it easier for people with disabilities to use documents and forms with or without the aid of assistive technology, software, and devices. And I think the point is that today there's a lot of assistive technology that is making this possible. There are screen readers, which I think we'll see a little bit later on with Stephani, screen magnifiers, which let people see people who have difficulty with sight, are not totally blind, see things very large, text-to-speech software, speech recognition software, alternative input devices of all kinds, like voice recognition instead of having to type, braille embossers, refreshable braille displays, which let blind people read not on a screen, but be able to read it through braille. Refreshable braille is the braille; those dots that you think of as braille move across, and they can and their fingers can sense them, so they can read large amounts of text rather than being able to read a line at a time. Next slide, please, Adam. So what is Section 508? And accessibility is not just Section 508, but Section 508 is sort of what's become a standard in the United States, foremost for the federal government, but it also deals with other things. And so it goes back to 1998, which really starts with 1973 with the Rehabilitation Act. In 1998, Congress amended the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to require federal agencies to make electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. And this applies to all federal agencies that either are public-facing in one way, or that need to be, or their employees need to have access to information. So the idea is that anything the federal government produces should be available to people with disabilities, either from the outside, taxpayers, or not, who are looking inside, or people who are working inside the federal government. So that's what Section 508 is, and there's a whole description of that in there if you look in the U.S. Code. But it was non-specific in a lot of areas. In 2017, and remember 1998, much of the technology we're familiar with did not exist. Cell phones did not exist. Smartphones did not exist. Laptops existed, but not so much. The internet didn't really exist to any great extent. So all those are new technologies that came in effect after that act. So in 2017, what was called the final rule went into effect, which was addressing all these new technologies that came along, and also recognized that there were other standards coming along outside the U.S. federal government. There's standards in Europe. There's the world. There's the WCG. There's all kinds of other regulations that have been promulgated throughout the world, which got incorporated to a greater or lesser extent into Section 508. So that came in effect in 2017. That's also called the refresh. And also part of this refresh was some very specifics on what needed to be done, as well as the idea that it had to be, to some extent, there were parameters on what is practical to do, and there were penalties imposed as well. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of, I think we said some of this already, but the refresh identified specific impairments that need to be considered. We talked about, what is visual impairments include blindness. It also includes color blindness, affect a large amount of the population. Includes macular degeneration. There's actually a few other things that are included. Hearing impairment there's complete hearing loss, but there's also limited hearing loss, and people who can't hear certain frequencies and stuff like that. Speech impairments, which affects, when a person cannot speak in response to a phone request, they should be able to type it. Mobility, strength, dexterity, reach impairment, not able to reach an entire keyboard. Disabilities such as epilepsy, which often, if somebody, like bright lights and bright flashing lights, will affect somebody with epilepsy. So keeping that in mind when designing websites and things. And cognitive function like dyslexia, but as others also. Next slide, please. Why it's important today, it's not just Section 508, all these others, it's important because it affects a lot of people. An estimated 18% of the world population, which is, to me, was an incredible number, experience some form of disability, and about half of that are severe disabilities. So slight hearing loss affects, affects a lot of people. What considered serious hearing loss affects a smaller number, but still a very significant amount. So 1.3 billion people are affected worldwide, of whom 400 million are children, and half of that 1.3 billion is people with severe forms of disability. And I think what's significant to note is that disabilities develop as people age. The population is getting older, so this number will actually, the percentage numbers will get larger over time. The other thing that makes it important is, 100 years ago, you couldn't do that much about it. Today, modern technology makes accommodation feasible. Remember, a lot of these laws require about reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation is easier today than it was before. The reading software can make all kinds of electronic documents accessible. OCR-based machines, as we saw, can read from paper. There's lots of other technology that is available. The other reason it's important is that people are getting sued. Government agencies have been getting sued by the constituency, both internally, employees are suing that they should have more accommodation and documents should be more easily available, as well as the public has been suing. So, for example, one agency where the agency is sending out notices, email notices, but the notices are not accessible. The union has sued that government agency that they need to make those documents accessible. The court ruled as a temporary measure that if somebody calls in and cannot read that document because it's not accessible, it has to be read to them, and they had to set up a whole phone setup for people to be available to read documents. You can see how that can be very costly. So private companies have also been impacted. And there's been lawsuits against Netflix and Amazon and other companies that are very public-facing, that their websites are not accessible, that their purchase sites are not accessible, and so on. Next slide. So one method that to make documents accessible is to retrofit existing PDF documents, which is what we talked about in a prior webinar. And I just want to point out some of the things that are critical that make documents inaccessible or accessible. One is reading order. If a document is just all single columned, presumably the reading order, you just follow the column. But if a document is like a magazine or a newspaper, it's not clear what the reading order is. Do you read a column across or down, or does it follow into another page? Reading order is a critical parameter. Color is an issue, and we'll see actually a little later that you can easily make a document that somebody who has full sightedness has very difficult reading a page. Imagine somebody who's either colorblind or has limited sight. Tables are very complex. Do you read them up and across or down or things like that? Images, if somebody's blind, they can't see an image at all. There's a need for alternate text to describe that image. Font sizes. You know, when you need to put your reading glasses on, well, font sizes are pretty important in all of this. Headings, lists, other navigational aids, this person knows how to go across a page. Forms are a particular complexity. How do you fill out a form if you have limited sightedness or limited dexterity? Making forms adaptable is very important. Maps, charts, timelines, all those have their own issues. And then when you get to specialty items like math and chemistry, that's its own thing. So luckily, there are ways of setting up math and chemistry today so that they're coded in a way that they can be read, but that takes its own special effort. So all these are relevant to all kinds of documents. So besides PDF, what we're going to talk about today, another method is to convert a document to XML or to author in XML, which allows a lot of flexibility, usability of material across many platforms. And Stephanie will go into that. In particular, today we're going to be exploring this method of using DITA, which is a particular form of XML. And of course, this is important because this is a lot of our business all along has been converting documents to XML. And I think that's, you know, now that accessibility is such an issue, has become, you know, this tremendous opportunity to use this format to make documents accessible and to retain them as accessible over time. And with that, I'm going to turn that over to Stephanie, and I guess the next slide.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so today we're going to look at some examples, and we're going to start with bad and kind of journey over to good. So let's look at a few examples of inaccessible content. Adam, can you pull up the first example? There we go. All right, so this, to be perfectly honest, I would say is probably not accessible by someone without a disability, but it's definitely not accessible to someone that does have a disability. This has a good example of bad readability. We see a lot of links throughout the page, a lot of different colored text, size text, different background colors, images without explanation. This would be pretty much impossible for a person that had a disability to actually navigate through this website.
A perfect example of reading order being totally unclear to anyone, I think.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what this company is selling, to be honest, but let's go ahead and look at the next example then. So, oh, one back, there we go. This is a little bit better, but you can see that there might still be some concerns about accessibility here. We have some difficult navigation if you look at some of the links placed throughout the site. They're not very evident. We also have some issues with color contrast and with the text sizes here that would make it difficult to use this website. And let's look at one more example. And as Mark mentioned, color blindness is considered as one of these disabilities as well. So it's really important that you're not relying on color to convey meaning. You can see an example of a transportation map here. And on the left, you can see that we're using color to identify the different lines. But on the right, you can see what a colorblind person would see. And they're going to have some difficulty probably navigating through this transportation system. So that brings us to our next example. Those were just a few fun ones I found. But today we're actually going to be looking at some sample content. This is the annual report put out by the VA New York Harbor Healthcare System's Cancer Program. And I've actually set up a video that we'll look at of a screen reader. This is JAWS, which is a very prevalent screen reader, reading through this piece of content.
The figure below represents the holistic approach to cancer care, which serves as the goal and the gold standard for VA NYHHS Cancer Program. In clinical interactions and cancer program design are challenged. demonstrate the prioritization of the cancer patient in appreciation of his or her experience as a whole person. No Veteran Alone program guarantees that no veteran dies alone. With collaboration of the nursing team and trained volunteers, every veteran is provided with reassurance, care, and companionship during his or her final hours. While concentrating on the planning and implementation of these new services, the cancer program broadened its scope in the following ways:
All right, so that was a good example of what someone would experience.
I just wanted to point out that that example of automatic reading of a screen display, you saw that it was very disjointed because the reading order was just not clear to the reading software, and part of that was due to the sidebars that were there. It thought a sidebar was the main text, and then went on to the next page. So you know, that's a big piece of what happens when material has not been designed specifically for a reading machine, and is not and therefore the reading machine doesn't know what to do with it. And part of what we do when we remediate is to define the exact reading order, so the reading machine picks up on that and knows exactly where to go from place to place.
So let's talk about how can we make this content more accessible. So Mark outlined a lot of what Section 508 entails, as well as some of the ways that people with disabilities may access content. And I want to dig a little bit into the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. WCAG is actually incorporated into the Section 508 refresh. And this is a really great thing because it actually harmonizes with international standards. So it's not just the US government saying this actually aligns with the European Commission, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, a number of countries, so that we're all on the same page as to what makes content accessible. It also incorporates a rating system. So there's a rating of A, AA, or AAA to indicate the level of compliance. A rating of A is the lowest rating, meaning you're just meeting the compliance minimums. And a AAA is the best, meaning you're doing a fantastic job making that content accessible. The WCAG standard also breaks everything into 4 pretty easy to understand categories, and I want to cover real quickly what those are and what we're looking for when we say, you know, is this content accessible or not? So the first category is perceivable. And that means that it's accessible to those with various disabilities. So a good example of that is text alternatives. As we saw in the screen reader example that we just showed, the figure was completely missed by the screen reader. That is definitely not perceivable to someone that's accessing that content in that way. It also needs to avoid any time-based interactions or media. If you've ever gone to a website that has kind of a scrolling, flashing screen that tells you different tidbits, that would be difficult to access if you're using certain tools. Perceivable also incorporates a simplified layout. So it's important to try and get that reading order correct and really simplify the information that's displayed so that everything is easy to see and or hear in your content. The second guideline is operable. And operable simply means that the content is navigable. If I'm trying to get through the content using an accessibility tool, I can do so. It means that there's adequate time allowance to complete any activities that you may need to complete. If you've ever had to submit a form and it says you have X minutes to complete this form before your session times out, we need to take into account those that may need some additional time. And it also avoids any seizure-inducing content, bright flashing things are definitely not good for those that suffer from epilepsy. The third guideline is understandable. And understandable means a few things. The content should be predictable. It follows a logical order. It provides some guidance as to where you are, so has some structure to it, so you know what you're, in some cases, looking at, or maybe using a screen reader to actually read that content to you. A very good example of where this gets kind of tricky is if you think of information that's conveyed in a table. It's very difficult if you are using a screen reader to understand that information because it does rely on the formatting to convey some of that. So having it be very clear as to where you are. And it also allows for correction. So if I have some difficulties with a screen reading tool, I can correct that and get to where I need to be. And then the final WCAG guideline is robust. And robust quite simply means that it's going to be compatible with assistive technologies. And that includes both current and future technologies. So we've seen a lot of technology evolving over the last even just several years. Many of us at home may be saying, Alexa, do this, or hey, Google. And there's going to continue to be more and more ways that people access content. Honestly, both with disabilities and those that don't have it. And so you want to make sure that your content is going to be compatible with some of those technologies as we move forward. So how do we get there? Today I'm going to look at an example and talk a bit about structured content, DITA specifically. And structured content works well for accessibility because it already has a good amount of inherent structure. If you're working in a software like Microsoft Word, you might use formatting to convey the importance of pieces of information. So you might format a title or header differently, or you might format a UI control. If you're saying press the X button, you might bold that to indicate that it's a UI control. And when you move to structured content, you're kind of getting away from that idea of formatting for structure, and you're actually putting it into elements and standardized items that are used to convey that. Structured content also has elements that are specifically designed for accessibility. One of those that we'll be looking at today is alt text. So when you have content that's in an image or a figure, you need to provide some alternative way to access that, and that's alt text. And structured content incorporates an automated and consistent publishing process. So when you're authoring content in XML or DITA, you're typically separating the authoring process from the publishing process. And the formatting and styling is actually applied using a publishing plugin. And that's one way to guarantee that at least the styling and formatting aspects that make content accessible are consistently applied, because it's all done using that plugin, which really kind of automates the process. So looking at DITA, I know many of you on this call are probably familiar with DITA or may be using it now, but I know there may be a few that are not, so I'm going to give a quick overview of what is DITA. DITA stands for Darwin Information Typing Architecture, and it is an open standard for creating XML content. It was originally developed by IBM and then made an open standard and given to Oasis in 2005. And basically what DITA does is it imposes a certain agreed upon architecture for technical documentation. So what's unique about it, it's topic-based, where you may have previously authored content in, say, a large Word document to create a user manual or a guide, and I'm just using Word as an example. In DITA, that gets broken down into much smaller chunks called topics that address individual items. It's further broken down into elements. So elements are used to actually put the content where it's supposed to be in the document. So instead of, let's say, putting in an ordered list if I'm doing a procedure and having my steps in that list, and then maybe using formatting to convey if something's an example, in DITA, you have elements for each of those things. So in a task topic, I would have steps, I would have a step example, a step result, step information. They're all individual elements, and that's all applying structure to my content as I'm creating it. And then lastly, all of these things are reusable. So once I create a topic or even put content in an element, I can reuse at any level throughout my content library in DITA. So now we're going to go ahead and look at an example in easyDITA, and I'm going to show you the same piece of content that we looked at with that screen reader in our software and show you how we would make this content accessible. So now you can see my easyDITA screen, and I have opened this annual cancer program report that we were looking at. On the left-hand side are all of my topics. So these are each of the topics that are included in this map, which is essentially kind of a table of contents for our publication. On the right, I have a preview of the document. So here I have exactly what we were looking at with the screen reader. I have a figure here and the text surrounding it. I'm going to go ahead and click Edit to open this up in the topic editor, and we'll take a look in more detail. So you can see some of the structure here as I click in each of the different elements. I can see that this is in a title element. Each of these sections are in a paragraph element. I have some options if I wanted to add a short description or other elements there. As I scroll down, here's the figure that we saw that screen reader just completely jump over. And it's in a figure element. And what I've done here to make this accessible is actually I've added some alternate text. So basically I'm just adding text that the screen reader can then read aloud to describe what is in the image. And there's actually a second image down here a little further, and I'm going to show you how I do that. It's quite easy. I'm going to just click on the image, and then I have this option to add alt. And when I click that, I get this alternate text element inserted here, and I'll start typing. I'll say, getting screened can save your life. And I would probably add the rest of the text here, but for conciseness, I'll leave it at that. And that's all I need to do. I just have my content in this structured DITA format, and I'm adding alternate text to ensure that we are making each of the images accessible. So I'm going to save and close those changes, and I want to show you one last thing, which is the publishing process. So if I click publish up here, you'll see that I have a few different publishing engines to choose from. These are connectors that we have. I'm going to show you the DITA Open Toolkit, so we'll click on that, and then I'll click New Publish. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. In talking about accessibility, there's obviously a number of ways to address this. And what I like about structured content is that it really opens up a lot of possibilities when it comes to how you publish that content. So you can see here on the left a list of available publishing scenarios, and I could publish this content right now to EPUB, slides, XHTML, web help, better web help, HTML5, PDF, Java help, SCORM, compiled help. You know, I have a lot of options here that are available to me, and these are just the scenarios I have set up here on my testing instance. Beyond that, if I click on one of these, I have this option here to choose a locale. So in this increasingly globalized world, I'm finding, I would say the vast majority of the customers I work with are publishing content in at least 5 different languages, if not more. And when you're publishing content to various outputs in various languages and accessibility is a concern, you want to have a consistent and somewhat automated way of doing that. So I haven't actually translated this content, but in the scenario that we wanted to publish it in, let's say, Spanish, I could create a translation job here in easyDITA and translate and store the localized content. And then I have an option that I can just choose what language do I want to publish in and publish to that language with a click of a button. So I've actually already published this content, and I'm going to switch back to our slide deck here, and I've created another video using that same JAWS screen reader to show you the remediated version. So let me go ahead and play that now.
The figure below represents the holistic approach to cancer care, which serves as the goal and the gold standard for VA NYHHS cancer program. Individual, clinical interactions and cancer program design are challenged to demonstrate the prioritization of the cancer patient in appreciation of his or her experience as a whole person. Graphic potential for programmatic action to address survivor needs. Graphic psychological needs. Graphic bullet social support matched peer-survivor support. Graphic bullet coping strategies to deal with fear of recurrence, anxiety, depression.
All right, so we'll go ahead and end that there. I didn't record quite as far because I was being conscious of the it would take to go through. But as you can see in this new version, we at least had all of the information that was in that graphic available to us through the alt text that we added before we published this. So DITA really can make accessibility possible, especially if you're considering how do I do this on a wide scale, or how do I publish to different outputs or different languages. And that's because we have a few things going on. We have the inherent structure of DITA, so everything's in the correct types of elements, and that gives the screen readers or other accessibility tools what it needs to be able to parse through that content. We have elements for accessibility, like alt text. So we can add that alt text in our source content and make sure that we're able to publish it using that. And then I like the consistent and predefined styling. I think that this really takes away a big, scary piece of the accessibility equation, because a lot of it can have to do with the actual styling and presentation of content. By using a publishing plugin to publish, I can ensure that consistent output every time. So that is my brief example of how you could use DITA to make content accessible. And now I want to take us to some resources that are available, and then we'll answer some questions. Mark, do you want to go through some of these resources?
Okay, so I don't think I'm going to go through them so much. I mean, there's a series of things, if you look through them, that relate to 508 guidelines that are available in various places. The Access Board is a place where a lot of things are collected. There's also the VA has an excellent section on 508 and their level of support. There's other accessibility support organizations, including the DAISY organization, which is primarily dealing with educational materials. Adobe has its own accessibility things, and the W3 consortium, which is WCAG, is a quick reference and has a lot of material over there. You don't have to copy these down. It's available on the slide, but also we will send them out. We're going to do a follow-up email to everybody who's on here, and we'll include these over here so you can easily go out and take a look at these to get more information. I think that's the wrap-up for today. Stephanie did a great job on explaining a lot of material in a very short amount of time. I'm sure there's more, and right now I'm going to stop and leave some time for questions, get it back to Adam and see if there's any questions that need to be asked. But if there are more, please don't feel free to ask. You can email us or get in contact with either Stephanie or myself if there's any other questions that you'd like addressed, either directly or maybe in a future webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam, and thanks Stephanie for a terrific presentation. Adam, you're on.
Thank you, Mark and Stephanie. We've had several questions that have been submitted. The first one being, how can you be sure you're in compliance?
I can take that. So the number one way to ensure you're being compliant would be to actually hire a third-party firm to do an audit of your content, and that's how you can get certain certifications such as the WCAG compliance level grade. And if you go to wcag.org, I believe it is, they have some or actually, I'm sorry, webaim.org is the one I'm thinking of, which is Web Accessibility in Mind. That is a really great organization. They have a lot of resources available, including access to third-party auditors that can actually look through your content. Aside from that, I really think a big piece of this is how much you can automate. So we saw that the styling gets automated with the publishing plugin. That's a good way to ensure that that piece of your content is accessible. We also have some reports available, such as a report that would enable you to look for any images that don't have alt text applied to them. So that's one way to go through and check your content, make sure that you're consistently applying that alt text. So there's a number of ways. Also at webaim.org, they have a tool called Wave that you can plug your URL into to check your website for accessibility issues, and it'll give you some quick feedback on that. So those are a few neat tools and options available to you.
Yeah, no, I just want to add, I mean, there are some tools that you can use to check for technical compliance, and those are very useful. I think everything should be run through that. Things like color and things like that sort of needs to be a visual kind of thing, and I think the key on that is to simplify as much as possible, and that makes your content much more likely to be compliant. We haven't really touched on forms and those kind of structures, but also they need to be readable, and I think somebody testing them is just a good idea.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Mark. The next question has come in is, how does one decide when to remediate PDF files as opposed to converting to DITA?
Right, so let me take that one. I think it depends on what documents you have and how much of it you have. If your organization has much of its material already in PDF, and it needs to be made accessible, converting that to XML and to DITA may just be too overwhelming a task, especially if these documents are just going to stay the way they are. So many government agencies have this situation, insurance companies, companies that have lots of policy kind of materials that are just sitting available in PDF. I think in those cases, remediation is probably the better choice. On the other hand, if you've got documents that are in some kind of living form and they're going to be edited and they're going to be used over time, then I think the best way to preserve the asset value of your documents would be to convert them into a structured format, and DITA is certainly a very good choice for many kinds of documents, and that lets you preserve the asset value as things change over time. So I think those are the parameters to consider when you're trying to decide which way to go. Stephanie, do you have something to add to that?
I think you hit most of the points. Like you said, if it's a living document, if it needs to be maintained and updated. I also think that if you have multi-channel publishing, in other words, you need to be able to publish HTML and PDF, or even to other outputs. DITA can sometimes be a good option. And the same thing with translating content. If you're publishing in a lot of languages, it might be easier to move to a structured format so you don't have to keep remediating those PDFs.
Right, exactly right. I think multiple languages is a major driver to be going into a structured format like DITA, so that you can keep multiple language formats in sync, and you can use translation memory and all those other tools to minimize the cost of translation.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Stephanie. The next question has come in is, on what grounds are private companies getting sued over accessibility issues?
So do you want to take that, Mark, or would you like me to?
Why don't you I think both of us have things on that topic. Why don't you start?
Okay, so the same way that the ADA says that public spaces need to be physically accessible to people. So for example, if I'm going into a building, is there a wheelchair ramp? The same thing is starting to be found in these private lawsuits against private companies, in that they're saying content that's made available through the web needs to be accessible. So I know, for example, I think you gave the Netflix example, Mark. They were sued because they didn't have subtitles for a lot of their videos, I think. And that's considered to be public content. Target, I believe, was sued because their purchasing checkout process was not able to be completed by someone using assistive technologies. So it didn't say, you know, here's where you put your name and address and credit card number. There wasn't enough guidance to make that usable. Those are the two that I'm pretty aware of. And Mark, I'm sure you have more to add.
Right. So I mean, what's happening? I mean, the ADA is essentially requiring that public-facing information be compliant, be very accessible, and also for, the flip side, that's to potential customers or users system. The other side is that you need to provide reasonable accommodation to employees so they can do their job with all the material that should be available to them. So those are the two sides of it. So the lawsuits are coming in based on that. Just like if somebody cannot get access to a building, they can sue under the ADA, and if you have a group of people, it becomes a class action. It could become a class action. Likewise, what's happening is in these other areas where people want access or have reasonable need for access, they're suing on those bases. So you know, on the one hand, not everybody is currently under this. But over time, it's going to become more and more, as these tools are available, it's reasonable to provide this kind of access, and there's going to be more lawsuits on that. I mean, just another example of that, in the educational environment, a student has a right to be able to get their materials in an accessible form. So while till now, schools have been doing this on a one-by-one basis. A lot of times a student comes in and says, I need the following books for my course, and they will go and OCR it and do some other things to it to give them something minimal. The demand is getting higher and the bar is getting raised, and now some school districts will not even accept a book for a course unless those materials are also available in an accessible format. So it's just becoming more and more of a social issue, and that's where a lot of the pressure is going to come.
And Mark, I just want to add one last thing. You know, beyond the potential concern about lawsuits, you know, I really think that accessibility right now is just a good best practice. It opens you up to a lot of additional customers and additional people that may not have been able to access your content. It typically makes that content more accessible for everyone, not just those that have disabilities. And you mentioned that this affects 18% of the population. I believe the number is that reflects about $200 billion of discretionary spending. So it's definitely something to consider whether or not you're worried about legal action, just as a good best practice.
Right. I think the three pieces of it, a major driver a lot of times is legal action, but it's also good business. It's a very large customer base, and the other thing is that social responsibility is also taking us in that direction. It's a good thing to be doing. So I think those are three drivers that are out there. I mean, there's the whip, but there's also the carrot there.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Mark. We have several more questions that have come in. The next one is, to what extent does 508 apply to developmental or design tools? For example, would it apply to the design of a page layout tool?
So Section 508 says that it applies to all software and electronic applications that are procured, used, or distributed by the federal government. So I would say that if that design tool is being used by a government entity, it would potentially be a concern, since they have to go through that procurement process and ensure that they're following that 508 compliance.
Right. I think that falls under the reasonable accommodation kinds of guidelines, but I think more and more as these tools become available, it'll be defined as reasonable accommodation to make them available. So it may be that if one such tool is accessible and another isn't, a government agency and private organizations would veer towards the one that is accessible, and that would be, I guess, a competitive advantage. Adam, anything else? Any others?
Yes, what was the organization site that offers accessibility auditing?
That's Web Accessibility in Mind is the organization. Their website is webaim.org. And we'll send out the links for all of the resources as well.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And the last question that has come in is, can alt text be used to explain flowcharts or GIFs?
I would say yes. I would say alt text can really be used to explain anything visual. So if you're inserting that as an image into a document in DITA, you can add alt text to describe what is in it. I've seen examples of things like a map of a building described using alt text so that someone who couldn't see the map could understand the basics of it.
Right. And I think alt text is a catch-all, so anything that can be described visually would be done that way. In specialized areas, you might choose another way to do that. Like, for example, a mathematical equation. In many cases, the tools aren't there to do it electronically. It might be described and read, and with text inserted as an alt text. On the other hand, if you're in XML and using MathML, which is a formula description language with an XML, then there are readers that will read the MathML code directly, so you don't have to have alt text. So the alt text is a catch-all, but in specialized areas, and if that's where you're working, there may be specialized tools that can be read by the automated tools that are out there.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Mark, for this very informative webinar. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar along with the resources in the webinar archive section of our website located at dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, February 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Using Structured XML to Power Your Learning Content, being presented by Dawn Stevens, President of Context Services, and Amber Swope, DITA Specialist of DITA Strategies. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.